Hi everyone, welcome, very warm welcome on this very, well, at least in Liverpool, very cold and wet afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be introducing Matt Bishop. Matt's going to be talking today on a topic which is obviously about the Caribbean and concerns people and in the region very closely. But I guess is an existential question for us all to some extent. So Matt spent some good time in the Caribbean, University of the West Indies in Trinidad. Beyond that, he's worked all around the world, really, Singapore, China, even Warwick, I hear, as well as the Netherlands. And he's currently a fellow of the UK Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology and co-director of the Resilient and Sustainable Islands Initiative. And he's going to be talking a little bit about about those things as the context out of which this paper emerges. So on that note, Matt, I'll hand over to you for your paper. What does a genuinely just transition mean for the Caribbean? Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for coming. So as Jack says, I was going to start off by giving a bit of context about where this work is coming from and where it kind of started. So during the pandemic, when we were on lockdown, a bunch of friends of mine, colleagues, people that I knew with an interest in small island sort of politics, small island development, decided to get together virtually just to have a kind of a bit of a discussion group. We thought it would be interesting to meet up while we were all stuck in our houses. And this group of colleagues that situated all over the world, some people in the Caribbean, some people in the UK, some people in the Pacific, essentially started thinking and talking more and more and more about how we saw the emerging sort of kind of COVID, post-COVID context and what it might mean for development in small island developing states or SIDS. And out of this, we wrote two long papers, which I'm happy to share with people if you get in touch afterwards, but you can find them if you Google them. The first one is called Towards Sustained Development in Small Island Developing States. And the second one was a shorter policy brief called Sustaining Development in SIDS, a Reform Agenda. And in these two pieces of work, we made a broad argument, which is that the context in which SIDS development has to take place today is changing quite dramatically. And we identified three sort of problems that SIDS face today. One is that the kind of globalization niches that have sustained their development probably since the late 1990s are increasingly under threat. So offshore finance is experiencing much greater metropolitan surveillance. Tourism during the pandemic experienced its second once in a generation shock, where it kind of closed down for months on end. After the global financial crisis, where there was a huge shock to the tourism economies of many small island developing states. Sovereignty sales are getting more difficult, and so on and so forth. So that was the first problem we identified, the kind of constraining of development options that many small island states have. The second was geopolitical upheaval, this sense of degradation in the global multilateral order and the institutions that had allowed for a fairly permissive world order in which SIDS have been able to pursue their interests, and in many cases have a significant influence over global affairs, certainly an influence that belied their relatively small size. And the third one was accelerating climate change. Things are getting much more scary in terms of the way climate change is going. And this group of people wrote these two papers because we felt that there was a sense that we wanted to make a kind of intellectual statement about the way things are. And we're currently turning those into a Cambridge University Press book, which will be written and finished over this summer. Now, the reason I give this context is because this culminated in the establishment of the institution that Jack just mentioned, the Resilient and Sustainable Islands Initiative, which is a think tank that has been established at the Overseas Development Institute in London. If you Google Resi ODI, you'll find our website. And we've increasingly institutionalized all of this work that we've been doing within the think tank And we work across 4 thematic areas: financial stability, environmental justice, international alliances, and equitable societies. And I'm the director that is, or the co-director that is in charge of the equitable societies theme. And essentially what we're trying to do with Resi is create a space where we can develop a policy-focused research agenda that facilitates interactions between both policymakers, whether they be national policymakers, national governments, international organisations, regional organisations, and academics, activists, other people with an interest in these kinds of 4 big picture challenges that many small island developing states face. So what we're trying to do essentially is connect the policy world to the academic and activist world in ways that are mutually beneficial, because it seems to us that across these really crucial areas of activity, there is not always a great conversation that takes place between these different groups. We're always looking for affiliates, kind of honorary fellows for people that are interested and want to be involved in Resi. And if any of you are interested in the kind of work we're doing, you're more than welcome to send me an email and I'll put you on our mailing list for public events and so on. And that's a long-winded way of saying that as a group of people, we've become interested as one of our kind of research agendas. We've got a few different research agendas ongoing at the moment, but one of the things we've become interested in is this question of a just transition and the extent to which a kind of body of literature that has grown up to explain particular kinds of changes within the global politics of climate change can be better applied to the situation faced by many small islands. So the paper that I'm going to present over the next sort of half an hour started life as a British Academy report, which again you can find if you Google it online. It's called Just Transitions in Small Island Developing States. And about 18 months ago, the British Academy asked us to write a paper sensitizing people with an interest in this broad question of just transition as to how it affects small island developing states. And this was part, I guess, of a wider sort of policy agenda in the run up to COP26, when the United Kingdom hosted that summit in Glasgow, where for all of a sudden, lots and lots of different academic and policy institutes in the UK started to take much more of an interest in the kind of special problems faced by small island developing states. Climate change made it much, much more strongly onto the government's agenda in the UK. And to be honest, the current British government, for all of its well-documented problems and instability, has invested a huge amount of money into action on climate change and has been a pretty supportive donor in terms of its kind of sort of seeking to influence the kind of the world of development to deal with the problems faced by small island states in a better way. And that's something I'll come back to later on when I talk a bit more about some of those kinds of questions. So this started off, as I say, as a British Academy report, and we're currently in the process of trying to turn it into a more academic, scholarly paper. And the ideas that are underpinning that paper are what I'm going to talk about for the next short while. So by way of introduction, sort of the opening gambit, I guess, is that transitioning away from carbon intensive industries has become an urgent global priority. And broadly speaking, the idea of a just transition speaks to the notion that that transition has to take place in ways that generate ecologically and socially sustainable outcomes. So essentially, as you move away from very carbon intensive extractive sectors, the people that experience those shifts are not excessively dispossessed, that they're able to move into different kinds of work, that the communities that previously relied on particular kinds of polluting industries aren't adversely affected, that there are some kinds of replacement activities that they can do, and that the industries that grow up in their place are able to also sustain good jobs and living standards and so on and so forth. This, as I say, has become an urgent global priority, and it has generated a burgeoning academic literature and activist literature as well. However, there are important and underappreciated limitations to this concept as it's presently conceived when applied to SIDS. Put differently, the existing just transitions literature is increasingly dominating a lot of thinking on climate change, but it doesn't travel well to SIDS in general or the Caribbean in particular. And this is a real problem because, of course, these are the territories that are most likely to experience the most harmful effects of climate change the most rapidly, particularly so in the case of the low-lying atolls in the Pacific, but all small island developing states to a greater or lesser extent are on the very front line of climate change. They're the proverbial canaries in the coal mine. And the reason it's a problem that the literature or the concept doesn't travel well to them is that they are unique in terms of size, they're unique in terms of their capacity to respond to climate change, they're unique in terms of the extent of their exposure to outside forces. And this means, as I said, that climate change will affect them more rapidly and probably more devastatingly than any other group of states. And yet, despite this, and aside from some sort of critical post-colonial literature, there's precious little research on the subject of a just transition as it pertains to these societies, and that is a massive oversight in the literature. So the question that I think animates the presentation here is, how should we comprehend a just transition in this distinctive context? What does this actually mean in the context of small island developing states? What knowledge and resource gaps need to be filled to implement and envision and implement such a transition? And how might we actually help to contribute to both academic debates on making the concept more relevant to SIDS, but also how might we contribute to the kind of policy conversations that are taking place about actually implementing some of these shifts? So to begin with, I'm going to talk about the just transition debate briefly, talk about some of the problems with it. The first and obvious question to pose is, what is a just transition? What do we actually mean by this concept? And in some respects, it's a seemingly straightforward proposition, right? The idea of a just transition speaks to the idea that we should be transitioning away from fossil fuels and we should be decarbonising existing industries. And then on that basis, generating new green industries that are founded on renewable energy, renewable technologies, cleaner sources of energy. And that this should and can be undertaken in ways that are socially equitable and environmentally fair. So it's a transition away from carbon intensive industries, and it's a transition which is just. It generates justice. So it actually potentially even improves the condition of the people who experience it. This was a notion that was first adopted just over a decade ago by the International Trade Union Confederation. So it's a concept that has emerged from the activist space rather than the scholarly or policy space, at least initially. And it's based on the idea that jobs and the environment are not irreconcilable. So that a greening of the economy doesn't necessarily imply that you have to experience reduced living standards. Decent living standards and possibly even better living standards are perfectly reconcilable with this transition. And even more than that, there's an implicit argument that the costs of economic greening, and in particular the costs of adjustment, should not be borne by vulnerable populations. They should be borne by those with the broadest shoulders. So a just transition refers to the simultaneous transformation of societies and economies towards a low carbon and climate resilient development, while creating rather than inhibiting opportunities for environmental sustainability, social equity, and economic prosperity. So much like the kind of early debates on sustainable development in the sort of 1980s and 1990s, there's this kind of implicit assumption that a positive multiplier can be generated, whereby you can still have decent amounts of growth, you can get a greener economy, and it can also be more socially just and more equitable. Now, there are obviously critical thinkers who you don't even have to be of a Marxist persuasion to sense that this is potentially quite a problematic way of thinking in general. And obviously there's a huge literature, in particular I'm thinking of the degrowth literature, which is pretty skeptical of these kinds of claims. But nonetheless, taking it at face value, the idea that animates much of the just transitions debate is that we can get this kind of positive cycle of green development that is socially and ecologically equitable. And it features in a whole range of kind of official policy pronouncements. So it's there in the UNFCCC, it's there in the Paris Agreement and the Silesia Declaration. But up until now, on the official documentation that has been published on just transition within the kind of UN international organization space, very, very few small island developing states have generally signed up to just transition, just transition imperatives. In part, I think that's because they don't really see that it has much to say that animates or helps with their specific condition. And there are three problems, I think, that we can identify with the concept itself or the notion itself. The first one is that it's extremely narrowly conceived. So I said just now that the notion of a just transition is quite a straightforward proposition. It simply means adjusting and decarbonising in ways that are fair. And this is a strength in many ways because it allows for a narrow focus on what the sort of objectives of a just transition are. But it's also a weakness because it hasn't been elaborated fully in a theoretical sense. There isn't a big conceptual literature that problematizes it in a kind of philosophical sense. There is some of that literature, but it isn't an obvious or dominant tendency within much of the debate on just transition. So there isn't much of an intellectual debate. The debate tends to be much more at the practical level. And this is a problem because the notion of a just transition embodies a whole range of quite serious social, political, and ecological conflicts. So not only does the idea of what is just mean very, very different things to different people and different groups, and that obviously has a hierarchical basis to it as well. The multiplicity of transitions that are conceivable within this broad envelope of decarbonising in ways that are fair can imply very, very different trade-offs for different groups, and they can fall disproportionately painfully on particular groups, whether they be indigenous communities, whether they be gendered communities, whether they be particular racialized communities, whether they be urban groups as opposed to rural groups, coastal groups, whatever it might be. The distributional consequences of these processes can play out quite painfully along race and class and gender lines and national lines as well, and north-south lines as well. So those trade-offs don't play out remotely equally, and they can't play out equally, arguably. And what this means for SIDS is it's not just that that we need to think about a just transition in terms of particular groups within society. It's that SIDS are so small that we need to think about an entirely different society. So we need to think about a different kind of society. The transition itself implies quite a stark adjustment for a whole island territory or a whole island community. I'll come back to the SIDS analysis shortly. The second problem with the concept of a just transition is it refers to particular kinds of interventions and the idea that more equitable outcomes can come from dismantling polluting industries. And this is a good thing in general, right? We all want to see a world in which emissions are gradually reduced and in which the most dirty polluting industries are gradually taken out of action, and they're replaced with greener technologies and greener sectors. But the problem is that those industries are based predominantly either in richer countries, northern countries, or in larger developing countries. So like the BRICS, China, India, Brazil, maybe Indonesia, places like that. And in many cases, they also have outsourced their emissions to poorer countries as well. So it's very easy, or relatively easier, for a country like the UK to reduce emissions and to decarbonise, in part because a lot of the dirty work of industrial production, Britain doesn't actually do it anymore. It's been outsourced somewhere else, usually in the global south. But beyond that as well, even large developing countries have a varying capacity to transition. And this is in part because of the imperative of developmental catch-up. So many developing countries, big developing countries, quite reasonably make the argument that their industrial revolution has been much shorter than the industrial revolution that many Western countries went through. And they should be entitled to have that period of dirty industrial development in order to be able to catch up. The argument that lots of Chinese scholars make, for example, is that China has only been able to invest the amounts it has in its massive renewable sector by virtue of the fact that it has been able to have such a sustained sort of 40-year period of genuine kind of industrial revolution, which, as we know, has been very, very heavily polluting. So there are a whole set of tensions there. But there's also this wider problem that most of the literature focuses on kind of labour redeployment into green sectors, fossil fuel divestment, and so on and so forth. And broadly speaking, for SIDS, none of these issues are particularly relevant. So in most cases, small island states do not have large-scale industries to decarbonise or transition away from, with a few exceptions, of course. Think of Trinidad and Tobago, where I used to live, which has a significant energy sector. But in general, most SIDS don't have heavily polluting sectors to move away from. And if they did, and this is the crucial point, they would have precious few other sort of foreign exchange generating options. So it's not like in the United States, let's say, where you can decarbonize a particular mining area or something like that. And there are all sorts of cross subsidies that can then come from the federal government and state government. There are all sorts of other options for generating new replacement industries. SIDS generally have a very, very narrow export and generally very narrow economic development panorama. There aren't many other options. So if you eliminate one sector, it's not obvious necessarily what sector might replace it. And so the developmental consequences can be absolutely enormous. Again, I'll come back to the SIDS analysis in due course. The third problem with the just transition concept is that most of the work on just transition emphasizes locality and community-based solutions. And it is implicitly in some ways grounded in these sort of wider debates about degrowth or post-growth and aiming for greater self-sufficiency. Now, again, broadly speaking, this is a good thing, right? I mean, we should all be consuming as much local produce as we possibly can, and we should all be engaged in our communities as much as we can be. The problem in many small island developing states is that they are both highly open economies. So they're inherently exposed to the global economy to a far greater extent relatively than bigger countries are. And they lack both state and civil society capacity. So in many respects, a meaningful localization that generates a transition or mediates a transition in a SIDS context doesn't really mean scaling down ever further. It arguably means scaling up to a kind of regional or even global level. It means finding resources from elsewhere that can help to contribute towards stabilization and so on. So all of this opens up what I think are quite thorny questions about power, voice, inclusion, and so on and so forth. So there's some problems with the concept. I'm going to talk a little bit about SIDS now. So envisioning a just transition in SIDS, I think, is anything but straightforward. The concept itself might be straightforward, but envisioning this transition is not. It requires a recognition that the distinct shared set of macro challenges that they face heavily constrain their available courses of action or impose substantial costs on getting them wrong. I'll come back to that in a moment. Moreover, the nature of their transition is very different to that of larger states. The extent to which it is or can be just in any meaningful sense depends on a range of characteristics that are unique to small islands. So the concept itself, if it is to be taken seriously in a small island context, must account for the well-known special characteristics of SIDS. And these have long featured in the academic literature devoted to them and been reiterated at various fora over the years, as early as the 1994 Barbados Programme of Action, the 2014 Samoa Pathway, and whatever document comes out of the Antigua SIDS meeting next year will reiterate the importance of taking the special situation of small island developing states seriously. We think that there are three distinctive features that are crucial when thinking about the kind of the development context in which they function. One obviously is size. SIDS are small. In some cases, they're tiny. They have limited human capital, very little by way of a developmental hinterland, unless they're some of the biggest SIDS, maybe Jamaica, maybe Guyana, maybe Papua New Guinea. And they face, as I've said, severe capacity constraints in terms of human capital and so on. Geography matters too. They tend to be remote, insular, and are often highly dependent on external economic forces, extremely open to international trade, and have historically required special and differential treatment. for development. Again, that's something I'll come back to as well. And then history matters too. Many, but not all, have experienced acutely painful colonial histories of exploitation. And as a consequence, and particularly so in the Caribbean, are quite distinctive plantation economies. And this means that their contemporary kind of economic development, as successful as it is in many respects, is generally oriented towards capital extraction. Industrial development has rarely been very successful in most small island developing states, and there's a huge debate over the extent to which this is a product of size, whether it's a product of particular kind of historically constituted class relations and so on, where powerful elites have a kind of vested interest in maintaining those kind of extractive structures. They therefore face deep-seated structural constraints. And what this really means is that there are huge sunk costs that have to be invested in enacting statehood, developing new industries, building infrastructure, or crucially, in the case of this particular piece of work, transitioning away from fossil fuels. And what I mean by that really is that the investments that small island states choose to make in any major kind of activity, whether it be establishing a foreign ministry abroad, whether it be building transport infrastructure, whether it be facilitating the development of I don't know, a tourist resort or an airport or something like that, the costs of doing that are disproportionately larger than they are in bigger states. And not only are they disproportionately larger, the opportunity costs are disproportionately larger as well, because once you've spent, as was the case in St Vincent and the Grenadines, something like 100% of GDP on an airport, that is 100% of GDP that you can't spend on some other kind of investment. And even more on top, it's a disproportionate amount of money compared to what it costs a country the size of the United States or China to build just a single airport relative to your GDP. That's tiny. So these kind of sunk costs inevitably differ in extent when compared to larger states, all of which, regardless of their relative wealth or development, do have hinterlands, they do have large populations, they have deep connections to other states, they have a degree of self-sufficiency and the requisite economic and social scale to defray the fixed costs of those investments, which small states don't. So the costs for a small island of getting a transition wrong are again disproportionately greater than they are for a large state. They can't just write off a mistake in the way that a bigger country can. So SIDS experience a range of distinctive development paradoxes and interlinked problems linked specifically to their small size. So these paradoxes also influence the extent to which they're able to generate successful levels of development. So historically, most SIDS, with a few exceptions, have had historically quite high levels of growth or reasonable levels of growth, if fluctuating a bit, with historically constituted dependency on a narrow range of sectors. They've generated relatively high levels of income per capita, certainly when compared to other developing countries as a whole, and high levels of human development along pronounced levels of poverty and social exclusion. They have some of the highest debt burdens globally, but they're generally, again with a few exceptions, generally unable to access debt relief, official development assistance or concessional financing, in part because their GNI per capita is relatively high. They have very high levels of social capital, strong democracies, but this coexists alongside, in some cases, poor governance, constrained ability to deliver services, and a deteriorating social panorama in which increased violence and interpersonal violence especially is evident. They bear no responsibility really for climate change, but they're exposed to dramatic external climate-induced shocks and intensifying ecological transition. So the broad point I'm trying to make here is that the development kind of problematique facing many small islands is more acute in almost every respect than it is for larger countries, again, regardless of how wealthy or developed those larger countries might be. And they don't fit then into the existing conceptualization of just transitions for at least three reasons. So really, I'm just expanding on what I said in the previous section. So the first problem is that decarbonisation is about climate mitigation. It's not about adaptation. So these are the kind of two priorities that have governed global climate politics for the last few decades. Climate mitigation is reducing emissions. Adaptation is about adapting to the imposed harm of climate change. And for SIDS, the former doesn't really matter in the sense of them actually seeking to achieve mitigation. Like they could reduce their carbon emissions, but it will have a negligible impact on the global store of carbon emissions. Whereas adaptation really, really matters for them. It's a far more urgent priority. Yet at the same time, most international financing for climate change activity is geared towards mitigation. There's a disproportionate amount of money goes towards mitigation globally because globally the priority is seen to be reducing emissions. Much less money relatively goes towards adaptation, yet for SIDS themselves, because emissions are unlikely to be reduced sufficiently to offset the worst effects of climate change, they desperately need adaptation finance, which often isn't forthcoming. And as I said just now, the sunk costs of any kind of investment are disproportionately high in these territories. So even where there is a kind of imperative to mitigate, to reduce emissions, for many small island developing states, the costs of doing so are so much greater than they potentially are for bigger countries. So some of the things that might often be recommended to reduce emissions are, build a light rail network instead of having more automobiles, for example. Well, you can't really do that in a small island because the cost per unit of travel is so much greater because you're dealing with a much smaller population. The sunk cost of building those rail lines is massive. And you can think about this if you apply it to just about any climate sensitive investment. The same is true of just about any kind of major investment they do because of the opportunity cost that I talked about just now. So there's a real problem that in our existing debate about decarbonisation, it doesn't really deal with the interests faced by SIDS. The second problem, which I hinted at just now, is that SIDS don't have large extractive sectors that even could be decarbonised anyway. So the just transitions concept is kind of meaningless when it speaks to decarbonisation of those sectors. Now, of course, some do, right? Trinidad I mentioned just now. Papua New Guinea has obviously huge mining concessions and so on and so forth. Guyana and Suriname very recently have had huge discoveries of oil deposits. So there are perhaps questions here. But in general, most SIDS are dominated by service industries. And what this means, I think, is that the role that a service industry can play within the just transition framework needs to be taken much more seriously. Service sectors could be a site of transition. Tourism is an especially thorny example here. Most SIDS, as we know, are tourism economies, and most of them are disproportionately over-reliant on what is a deeply unstable sector. Some Caribbean countries generate something like 80% of their foreign exchange reserves, up to 80% of their foreign exchange reserves from this one sector. In many territories, it accounts for 50% of GDP. It accounts for an enormous amount of the economy. So when tourism slows down, as it did during the global financial crisis, or it did during the COVID pandemic, the entire economy is affected, which is a completely different picture to the situation in a larger state with a more diversified economy. And this is a real problem because tourism is an important anchor for economic development, right? It keeps airports open, it keeps planes full, it ensures foreign exchange comes in. But at the same time, it's an enclave that reproduces all manner of problems, from kind of neo-colonial patterns of investment and control to currency instability to very, very volatile employment, to the degradation of coastal spaces and so on and so forth. But there's a real tension here because on the one hand, tourism is perhaps an industry which could be decarbonised, and we could think of it in just transition terms, in decarbonising terms. But that process of decarbonisation could also potentially reproduce a wider pattern of exclusion and so on and so forth. And if you speak to people working in the tourism sector in the Caribbean, the kind of the people doing the policy thinking around tourism, one thing they will often say is that, well, actually, we still, even if you counted all of the tourism emissions, the aviation emissions within, counted them up, and you you place those emissions onto our carbon ledger rather than on the developed countries' carbon ledger where the people have come from, we would still make a negligible contribution to global climate emissions. So actually, we should just be allowed to continue maintaining the tourism sector in the way that we do. So there are serious questions here about kind of historical patterns of emissions accumulation and equity within that, and so on and so forth. And then the third point, as I've suggested already, is that the rescaling is not necessarily synonymous with localization. SIDS have severe capacity and capital constraints domestically, especially so in some of the very smallest island states, and especially in the archipelagic states. So thinking of places like Kiribati in the Pacific, which have to deliver services, way beyond kind of just the single island. And that creates huge difficulties, that creates huge problems in terms of the state being able to exercise its authority over those spaces. And as I said just now, they often need support in scaling up regionally, globally, so that any meaningful localization actually implies generating institutional architectures where critical masses can be achieved, power and ideas harnessed, and conversations influenced outside. So all of that is a kind of, I guess, a critique or some analysis of where the just transitions debate as it stands doesn't really take SIDS as seriously as it might do. I suppose the final section here is reflecting on how we can change the concept or adjust the concept of a just transition and move forward with a kind of practical agenda for thinking about SIDS more seriously. And I suppose one thing to note by way of sort of starting is that there is no one transition to net zero, but many transitions. And it's far from clear what this means for SIDS in a world that's kind of preoccupied with but failing to achieve global climate mitigation. So one thing we'll all be familiar with is that ever since 1994, SIDS have continued to emphasize the need for 1.5 degrees of warming to stay alive. That was 1.5 to stay alive was the often cited phrase, but it's increasingly becoming clear that that is likely to be missed. Some scientists think that we're already not that far away from missing it as it stands. Certainly in the next 20 years, we're going to go beyond 1.5 degrees of warming, most likely because of the concentration of greenhouse gases. So it's a real problem. So decarbonisation isn't happening anyway at anything like the scale or pace that we need it to. And there are a whole series of problems, really. So one is that although decarbonisation might be worthwhile in general, it could also be counterproductive for SIDS. Their relative contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is limited. So as I've already said, their decarbonisation will have little appreciable impact on global targets. In most cases, they don't suffer the labour consequences of closing down extractive sectors. So actually, the just transition of particular groups of workers isn't much of a concern from them. So in all, the notion of a just transition or the transition itself is going to mean something very different. So what do we need to think about? What might it look like? What might the kind of notion of a just transition mean for SIDS as we go forward? Well, something to think about is that this is something that has to be, if we're thinking about a just transition globally, it's something that has to be made much more inclusive for a start. So it has to consider the interests and the situations of a wider number of societies. So not just big polluting countries with big extractive sectors, as I've already suggested a few times. It has to be sensitive to the idea that big states and their big carbon intensive sectors are not the whole story. And then thirdly, for smaller societies, a transition that is just might not be solely about decarbonisation, but it might actually be about something else. It might take us beyond simply this idea that decarbonisation, in order to reduce emissions, is the whole story of seeking to adjust. So I've got four kind of claims I want to make just before I wrap up. I'm going to speak for a few minutes more. The first one really is thinking about what is just and what is a transition for SIDS. And I think what we need to think about here is centering the idea of adaptation, thinking that adaptation is far more important than mitigation. And we need to think about the ways in which SIDS can better adjust to a world in which climate change is intensifying. This isn't to say, of course, that we should give up on global mitigation. That kind of agenda is going to keep rolling forward, but it's seemingly quite unsuccessfully at the moment. But the main thing that is required here is that more finance needs unlocking for adaptation in general, but also for SIDS in particular. And the key question kind of underpinning this sort of argument here, or the key thing that we need to think about, is that a just transition in SIDS involves identifying adaptive transitions and supporting them, not worrying too much about decarbonisation. And we need to think then that what is actually at stake in SIDS when it comes to such a transition is managing the environmental and social consequences of rapidly accelerating climate change itself, rather than seeking to manage the adjustment to try and stop climate change. That is one massive way in which this notion could differ or should differ when thinking about their situation. The second point is that the scope of the concept requires dramatic expansion. So not only is it not just about decarbonisation or thinking about these big polluting sectors, it's also something that we may need to think about applying to tertiary service sectors, which is something that hasn't been done in the literature at all. And also thinking maybe about the possibility of graduated decarbonisation or even selective decarbonisation. And this is quite a controversial argument to make, but one of the things that we've been thinking about is recognising that although on the one hand, tourism as a sector globally has a huge carbon footprint and is a notoriously problematic industry in many ways, in the way that it plays out in small islands especially, could we actually think about conceptualizing tourism as an extractive sector, or should we even be thinking about protecting tourism and protecting certain kinds of carbon emissions, and saying that certain elements of certain industries shouldn't be decarbonised or don't need to be decarbonised in order to protect particular kinds of developmental gains that have been made? This is a really controversial idea, I think, and we're not entirely clear what we think about it in this paper so far. So on the one hand, we see tourism as really problematic and extractive, just like any other kind of industrial sector, like an oil field or a mining complex or whatever it might be. But on the other hand, we wonder actually if we're going to make this concept meaningful for SIDS and for SIDS policymakers, well, they might actually have very, very good reasons to suggest that we need to protect tourism in order to underpin the kind of adaptive transitions they need to make, rather than worrying about tourism's contribution to global mitigation. The third point, as I've said a couple of times, is really that a transition is about scaling up, not just scaling down. Because SIDS are kind of price takers and rule takers, their only available strategy to develop is to participate globally, whether that be in the global economy, whether that be in multilateral fora. And regional and global bodies are central to this endeavour, helping to offset the diseconomies of scale that they face. But at the same time, deep political integration to share sovereignty has struggled in the Caribbean for all of the reasons we know that CARICOM has struggled over the years, in the Pacific due to geographical remoteness, and in the Indian Ocean due to limited critical mass and proximity to continental African integration initiatives. But we think that a more radical scaling up is possible. The post-COVID era, in which technology is ubiquitous, is seeing physical barriers increase as metropolitan countries seek to restrict access to their markets and to their territory. But at the same time, virtual barriers are slowly breaking down and reformulating what we think of as localization and globalization. And there are opportunities here for scaling up SIDS initiatives. And the very establishment of our research think tank, RESI, is an example of this kind of activity. And then central to this, in the contemporary era, or the era that is hovering into view, international organisations need to do far more to augment limited SIDS capacity with their own institutional weight. And I didn't talk about this in great detail, but there needs to be much, much more effort on the part of international organisations to improve SIDS access to international financing. The UN is doing some really important work at the moment. In June, they're going to release a multidimensional vulnerability index, which they hope will unlock new sources of financing. But SIDS also need to receive a fairer share of and improved access to climate financing, and they need greater concessional climate financing, along with debt relief and budget support and long-term debt restructuring. So part of the agenda going forward in order to make them better able to adapt to the imposed harm of climate change, there's this whole set of other activities that needs to happen to unlock the kind of the money and the resources that will give them the greater policy space to be able to do that. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Matt. I think what would normally come now is a round of applause, but on Zoom it doesn't quite always work. Now, as you know, Matt, I have to shoot off at 5 because the kid's going to emerge. So I'm going to be quite audacious and actually ask, abuse my position as chair and actually ask the first question, if that's okay, and I hope others don't mind. What I wanted to ask was, I was very interested, being a historian, I'm very interested in the historical kind of trajectory of this situation. And I wonder how calls for reparations play into this debate, because obviously, you sort of spoke about this partway through the paper, that a lot of the power dynamics of colonialism are what are ongoing and what actually shape this. We're talking about industrialization being made off the back of enslavement, and industrialization is really the first, one of the first kind of steps towards this process. And I wondered if you could, I don't know, are people talking about reparations in relation to this, or is that just an entirely different issue? And if not, should it be relevant? I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
It's a really good question, actually. And some of the best literature that has been published from a kind of more critical angle on these sorts of questions has done exactly that. So Leon Seeley-Huggins, for example, at Warwick, published a really, really good piece on climate justice 3 or 4 years ago that was kind of making the case that the resolving this challenge is an important, crucial part of reparatory forms of justice. And obviously Hilary Beckles' sort of second book on the subject that he published recently has got into a lot of those debates as well. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for fruitful discussion and debate along those lines. And it seems to me that that's only going to gather pace as well. So I've been involved in a few meetings recently talking to sort of policymakers across the Caribbean, and a number of things, I guess, are happening here, and the recent shift with Barbados becoming a republic, Jamaica moving towards becoming a republic as well, I think are all part of the same kind of assertion of Caribbean independence on the international stage, right? So some of that is rhetorical more than it is substantive, but there is unquestionably a strong move in that direction. So I think those sort of claims are only going to get louder and louder. And it's also a productive thing as well. I mean, I can see Dylan is on the call. Dylan Kerrigan has written stuff in the past about the extent to which a lot of the kind of resources that could come the way of the Caribbean could and should probably be badged as reparations as well, right? So debt relief shouldn't ever be seen as this kind of gesture from the Western world. It should be badged as reimbursement for righting historical wrongs. And I suppose the other thing to say is that I don't want to sound like an apologist for the British government, but we're working quite a bit with the SIDS unit at the Foreign Office at the moment at Resi. And one of the really, really interesting things is that if you speak to people that are working on SIDS issues, whether they be within kind of donor governments or whether they be within the international agencies like UNDP or UNDESA or UNORS, OECD, they're all acutely aware of the constraints that small island developing states face now. I think to a far greater extent than at any time in the recent past. So they've all beefed up their SIDS units in the last few years, and they're all searching drastically for new mechanisms and ways to channel money to SIDS. And one of the problems that SIDS face, right, is that because most of them, or at least a lot of them, certainly in the Caribbean, have relatively high GNI per capita, that masks all of their development problems, that means that they're not eligible for the concessional financing, they're not eligible for official development assistance, as I said earlier. An increase, certainly in the late 90s and 2000s, donors didn't really care about this. Their whole view was, well, you're doing really well, so actually we don't need to make resources available to you. But that isn't the debate they're having now. The debate they're having now is, things are looking really, really bad on the horizon. We need to find ways to unlock financing. So my sense is that there is quite a positive movement in all of those sort of directions. Yeah.
Sure. Hi, Dylan, please go ahead.
Thanks, colleagues. So really interesting, Matt, really, really, really interesting. And I think like you have a very good hold on this area about what is a just transition. I felt like it was very useful in the sort of macro kind of context, but it made me think more about the sort of more the bottom level, the micro level. So one of the things we have, if we're thinking about just, is obviously that we have, stratification systems that still exist here that are very unequal, right? And they're very hard to break. We also, and I'm talking about the Caribbean for colleagues here, I'm based in Trinidad and Tobago, and also immigration is a huge thing in SIDS too, right? So we lose a lot of the human capital that might be required to be here in order to actually maybe build a more just society. So on some levels, I feel like this idea of a just transition and adaptation over mitigation, I really love these things. But then I was thinking about how elites in these countries, in sort of SIDS and some SIDS, are often, people wouldn't necessarily describe them in the context of sort of a moral justness or a fairness, right? They would say that there's this unequalness. So even if we were to sort of develop this idea of a just transition, the way it would impact the societies would still have to filter through this unequalness, this stratification. And so I'm wondering about that. And then on going back to the macro level, I was thinking about maybe in addition to one of the things that, because I did feel like you laid that out quite well, but in addition to maybe pushing for a just transition would be maybe to have, I don't know who, but somebody being, a champion from the region. For example, Mia Motley in charge of, as the Secretary General for the United Nations, when they change out Gutierrez, rather. That might be something that could go as a kind of as a multiple or multi-dimensional way of thinking about it. So you've got a figurehead who can champion it for SIDS, while at the same time we're thinking about just transition, we also have to think about the actual inequalities that exist and how sometimes when we're trying to fix things, we you get just on the macro level, but we kind of entrench the inequality on the national levels. And I don't think you necessarily have an answer to that, but I was just wondering what your thinking might be around those sorts of, I guess, how do you fit the macro idea with the more kind of meso micro level realities that play out in SIDS?
Yeah, thanks, Dylan. I mean, they're great comments, obviously, and I mean, this is something we've talked about a lot, right? And this is something we've written about. The micro level is one where people suffer not just the kind of long-term historical consequences of kind of the fallout of colonialism and the kind of post-colonial experience, but also the kind of exclusion of the Caribbean state, right, which itself can be really, really regressive. And so there's a danger, I think, actually, with kind of that, the sort of the Western sort of view of small islands, kind of romanticizing the small island policy arena, or romanticizing the elites. But it's the elites themselves, again, for historically constituted reasons, that perpetuate a lot of the exclusion. And this is kind of the big worry, I guess, in a lot of small islands. I mean, that, one of the arguments that we've made in some of the resi work elsewhere is that one of the best things that rich countries can do, which they're not going to do, is just open up more access to their labor markets, right? Make it more easy for people to work outside. But that creates exactly the problem that you just alluded to, which is that if you're trying to build a national, build social capital nationally, that's that undermines it. It might generate some revenue because you get some remittances and so on, but it pulls your best people away all the time. The implication of that as well is that there are wider problems, that when the worst effects of climate change hit, it's the people that are left behind that are the ones that suffer, right? It's the people that live on low-lying land. It's the people that live in Port of Spain, just in East Port of Spain, who are going to suffer the worst effects whenever there's runoff coming down the hills, whenever there's flooding, so on and so forth. And it's those people who also don't have the second passport. They're not the ones who will be able to get out and don't get to live with one foot in the country, one foot outside the country. So the exclusionary politics of even a successful transition are still pretty nasty, if you think about this from a much more kind of bottom up sort of level. On the point about who is a champion, Mia Motley's done so much for the region's sort of impact on the world stage. She stole the show at COP26. She's still being exceptionally vocal on all manner of different policy agendas. She's talking about kind of fairly mainstream agendas and quite radical ones at the same time. So she seems to have this brilliant ability to talk to the kind of Davos set just as much as she does to kind of critical people as well. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see where she does go when she's had enough of being Prime Minister, but I would have thought she'd be a great candidate for UN Secretary General. It won't be her turn for ComSec, I don't think. I think that will have rotated around to Africa or the Pacific next.
Yeah, it's an idea that Caribbean people are talking about, but I know these things play out in a sort of like a political level much higher than us. So it's there's obviously other people who stand for that. But I agree. One of the interesting things when you were talking about this just thing, I just wanted to add, sorry to butt in again, but interestingly, today Biden said they're going to drill for oil in Alaska because the high price of oil is so much globally. And then in recent times, Barbados has just done a deep sea investigation of whether or not they have hydrocarbons in the ground and that they could tap into them. And I think the report is suggesting that they do, and that they would want to tap into this. And the rumors I heard of the last meeting between the head of the UN and prime ministers of the Caribbean that happened recently was in the room. They told the Secretary General that he can't tell them that they can't use their oil and gas to develop their countries, and he tried to shut them down, and they said that they were not going to stand for that and they're going to do it anyway. So there's that and I don't know about this, more about this international relations, but that's something that's going to have to be smoothed out. So I don't know where that's going to go. Because Caribbean people do feel from the bottom up and in parliaments that they have a right to take out the oils and the gas that's in the ground to develop their societies. So that I sometimes I think academically in the anthropological way about this, is it about shifting people's kind of cultural understandings around these things? But I don't know if it's that simple, really.
Yeah, but that's a really important part of the justice question, isn't it? It's the same argument that's often made about offshore finance as well. I was at a meeting last week about kind of the overseas territories, and obviously Cayman and BVI and similar places have big offshore finance sectors. And their argument all along is, well, this is our development strategy, and we don't have to have high taxes if we don't want to. And if you don't like it, kind of tough. This is how we're going to develop. And I can totally see the argument for why Barbados and Guyana should be able to dig their hydrocarbons out of the ground. Why should they not be able to enjoy the development strategy that other countries have enjoyed? And you can see the sort of the injustice of the decarbonisation agenda if you think about this in terms of who's pushing a lot of it. So Clive Thomas in Guyana wrote some really good stuff about 10 years ago when the RED Plus initiative started. So this was the kind of global initiative whereby rich countries would pay poorer countries to protect their rainforests. And essentially the Norwegians used their sovereign wealth fund to give the Guyanese government money in order to protect parts of the Amazon. So from an ecological perspective, that's a good thing, right, at first glance. But actually, how did Norway get that sovereign wealth fund in the first place, right? It sold massive amounts of oil and gas in order to now be able to have super clean or at least present itself as having a really clean development. So yeah, it's a real problem.